Good question. No, I don't believe our stance has been strong enough. Now we have an Israeli ambassador here. I met with him a couple of weeks ago when he came back. He was away in Israel. As soon as he got back, I told him what I believed. I use your exact words: disproportionate response, and what we've been said. I don't believe that the government so far has actually invited the ambassador in to either meet with Murray McCulley or with John Key. I think, frankly, that's pretty disgraceful. I mean, in the situation like this, at least you have them in to explain what's going on in one of the world's most strategic importance conflicts. Secondly, on the issue of international law and Security Council. Yes, we want to be on the Security Council. Because I've lobbied with others for us to have it placed, no matter which government gets in. I think it's important that we have it placed in the Security Council. When we were last in the Security Council, we had the Rwandan genocide, and we acted with principle, and we were within Africa and around Africa. We stood up against for people that don't know, we stood up against the genocide that was happening there and denounced it really publicly. Colin Keating did that, and we should all be very proud of him. I was in Rwanda at the time, so I know what sort of influence it had. That was an easier one. It was a genocide, it was in Africa. This is a harder one. Now, if you violate international law and human rights law, we are going into that Security Council on the basis that we will uphold human rights law and international law, and therefore we need to be saying something along those lines in the situation as well. That's my own feeling. If we don't, then what we're saying is, look, we'll only talk about human rights law in the easy cases, not in the tricky cases. If we actually have to stand up for that, then we need to stand up and be counted on it. Now, that may not be necessarily good for our Security Council bid. It might be, it might not be. I probably think the numbers probably fall on the right side rather than the wrong side. You can never tell, but we should be doing the right thing. And if we're doing the right thing, then we should be now denouncing it much more strongly, and we should be doing the things that I just talked about.
Thank you, David. That's been really interesting. My name is Kay Jones. I've got friends in the BDS movement, which is boycott, divestment and sanction, because they say that the only way to get Israel to shift is going to be through financial pressures. Do you have a view on this, and whether the government after the election should be using that as a bigger tool for pressure?
Yeah, we talked about Kat in the back time. We were talking about exactly this just a minute ago as we came in. I've got friends of mine who are working in and around this, particularly with the European Parliament, to ensure that the 500,000 Israeli settlements who are manufacturing and growing and doing whatever in the West Bank don't sell those products as Israeli products. They're not Israeli. They're actually West Bank products. They actually should go on the Palestinian ledger rather than on the Israeli ledger. That's one thing. Secondly, any industry that is in any way remotely involved with the conflict, we shouldn't be investing in. And there was one that made the papers about a week and a half ago, where our superannuation fund was part of that. I mean, we have to be really careful now with our various investment funds to make sure that we don't get involved with it. In terms of just ordinary products, one, it's almost impossible, but I think I think that's more of a popular decision about what people feel about buying or not buying Israeli products. That's something that for everybody's conscience. But as for institutional investors, any investment in products that could contribute to the conflict and the violence, or to armaments or anything like that, then we should stop. That's my feeling. Yeah.
What's the level of the debate that goes on at these off-site meetings and even country houses? What do you agree on and what do you disagree on?
That's a good question. These things go on all the time, and I'm be honest with you, I'm rather cynical about them, frankly, because you pull in a bunch of sort of Israeli decision makers and a few Palestinian ones, and you sit around the table. And the one that I was at, we were monitoring, as the UN, the number of checkpoints in the West Bank, the ability for people to be able to move from, say, the top of the West Bank to the bottom, to be able to go to the hospital in Jerusalem or pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque or get to university or get to schools or anything like that. I mean, most people have to have, all Palestinians have to have an ID card that's issued by the Israelis as part of the occupation, and they give their ID card in and they go through these checkpoints. And if you're going from Nablus in the north of the West Bank down to Ramallah, you'll go through generally 3. It might be slightly less now. When I was there, it was 3. And you get out, the bus comes up, the bus stops, you get out of the bus, you stand in the line, you hold out your ID card and you go through, and then you get into another bus and you go down to the next checkpoint. And that's how you get through it. It takes you, you would drive this in about 45 minutes, and it would take you 3 hours sometimes, depending on how full the checkpoint was. So what I was doing is, within this was to talk about movement and access, so that people had the ability and the right to move. In the end, I'll be honest with you, I got pretty frustrated the longer I was there. I had to leave after 4 years. I was getting too worked up, really. And in the end, I just said, the Israelis wanted to talk to me about individual checkpoints. I said, look, it's about movement, the right to be able to move. It's a sort of a basic human right. I mean, it's inside the West Bank. It's not into Israel or into Jordan. It's just up and down within their own territory. And the real reason behind all this was because the checkpoints were around settlements, so that you didn't go near a settlement. So there were regulated flows. There was no attacks against the settlements. So the settlements dominated. We brought in actually a British general, 2-star general, to look at the security apparatus that was in place and to give his assessment of what was going on, and that was his conclusion as well. So in the end, I just said, look, they said, well, we want to choose this one here, and I said, look, I'm not really interested to talk about individual checkpoints. You want to take them out, take them out. If you don't want to take them out, we'll just carry on reporting them, because it's actually doing a lot of damage to your economy. And I mean, what's your answer to the ultimate solution to this? And it just got too frustrating. In the end, it put too much, not that you're scared of the responsibility, but put too much responsibility on you trying to ease a little bit one checkpoint. I mean, for heaven's sake, that's not it shouldn't be my role. Sorry, go down the back, yeah.
I've looked at and I've watched about the whole situation for all of my life, and I've never been able to think that I've always seen it as at least as bad as apartheid South Africa, and actually I think a hell of a lot worse, the oppression of Israel, the occupation of the Palestinian people, sort of thing. And I can't see that there's any reason why New Zealand shouldn't be expelling the Israeli ambassador, except that we're not really getting independent in our foreign policy, because I'm always short on just the detail I need, but didn't we eventually expel the South African ambassador?
No, I can't remember. So I tell you the reason you can do that. You can expel them, and for a lot of people that would, they'd feel, obviously better about it. The Israeli ambassador wasn't here. To be perfectly honest, I felt it was pretty useful for me to be able to call him in and to tell him what I thought of what was going on, and to have him relay that back to Jerusalem rather than not being able to do that. Now, I think that's a line call, to be honest with you. You might get to the point where you say, well, actually, there's no point in telling him what I think because he already knows. But as I say, we haven't had the government even pulling the ambassador in yet, let alone going the next step. And I would have thought it's a pretty important graduation to make before you chuck an ambassador out. So that's my logic around it. I've spoken to other people in the. We may review that. I'm not saying that we wouldn't agree to that as well, but it's a one-off hit. Once you've shot that particular bullet, there's nothing left. You know what I mean?
It's just that I think that there are two ways of looking at the situation. One is looking at the particular conflicts that come up and then go down now and again. But really, I'm looking at the whole big picture, and I can't really see it any other way than that Israel, Palestine is an apartheid state, and ultimately the only response to the apartheid state in South Africa was a boycott, and I understand the expulsion of the ambassador. So I can't really see that if we look at the big picture, how can we escape from doing that unless we're just applying a double standard, we could do that in the case of South Africa because it was easier for us in terms of perhaps our foreign relationship with.
I think our foreign relationship with South Africa, possibly even in New Zealand, was probably even more complicated than it is with Israel, to be honest with you. As I say, that's the logic around, and in many ways, what's kind of interesting about what's happened in New Zealand over the last 20 years, there's been a shift in terms of sympathy towards Palestinians, and I think that's really important for that to be communicated back. It's about your issue. A lot of people talk about apartheid South Africa and Israel, and there's obviously some very big similarities, some very big differences as well. One is, and the biggest is that South Africa purported to be one state with different people inside it. This is not one state. This is the state of Israel and two pieces of occupied territory that are not part of Israel. They're actually outside. And we've got to keep coming back to the fact that this is an occupation of 47 years. And the question is, how do you get beyond that occupation? The rules for that occupation were written immediately after the Second World War. They're in international law. They're drawn up in 1947, 1948. Part of the Geneva Conventions is about the occupation, and the rules came from both the German and Nazi occupation of Europe plus the American occupation, and they brought, in a sense, they looked at that. Occupations are not supposed to last a long time. They're supposed to last a few months or a few years. Occupations are not supposed to result in the occupied inhabiting and living in another territory. That's completely outside of international law. And there's 500,000 Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So we've got to be really careful. There's another. I said something about it the other day. The word genocide, for God's sake, let's use this word properly. It's really important. I was in Rwanda when there was a genocide going. This is not a genocide, okay? Really important to get the terminology right. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, congratulations. Well, I think it's an excellent appraisal of the situation in Gaza, and I appreciate the complications of having to refer to the West Bank in the context of the expulsion of the majority of Palestinians in 1948. What I really want to talk about was the situation that we can do something about here in BDS, of course, has been raised, but so too I think that Parliament can do something. And I think there was an opportunity missed in 2006 when the Attorney General refused to allow the police to execute a warrant for the arrest of prima facie charges of war crimes against the now Israeli Defence Minister when he was here in New Zealand. The warrant was issued, the Attorney General intervened to prevent that warrant executed. But can Parliament do such things as reverse the Israeli visa waiver scheme? It's one thing we can do there as parliamentarians. You seem to have the endorsement right across all the political parties in Parliament. It's never happened before on this issue, even though there has been a lot of bipartisan attitudes towards supporting the Palestinians. Can you actually do that?
The short answer is I'm not sure that Parliament can do it. It would obviously have to be a majority vote. Somebody could put it up. It would have to come up as a I'd have to look at it and how he was to do that. We're not going to obviously have another parliament until after the 20th of September. If this conflict continues on, I think what's been interesting, and you must have seen this in the media as well. Certainly, the BBC has done some opinion polling around of attitudes towards Israel around the world. And what's really interesting about it, if you look, and they did it in, I don't know, 25 different countries, I think it was several thousand people polled, is that it's changed here in New Zealand too, I believe. I mean, I was speaking to Phil Goff, who's been around a lot longer than I have. He looks like he has as well. We went to the same school. It's pity he's not here, because I usually use that joke when he's here. So. And he remembers a time when he began politics that almost 90% of the leaders would be pro-Israel, and now that's almost entirely reversed now. Certainly the leaders I get. And I have to say, I've had a lot of letters and people approach me from the Jewish community as well, who are concerned about the as I started off by saying that the sort of the anti-Semitism. And I think there's a really important issue here that this is about the actions of a state, not about the actions of a group of people. It's really important. At the same time, that group of people needs to make sure that they don't use that weapon against people who criticise the state. So it's a sort of a double-edged sword as well. We've got to make sure we never slip into that, because it's really, really important. So I don't know. I think we probably, when Parliament comes back, and depending on who's in government, what we end up doing, I can promise you that I'm a foreign minister. One of the first things I do would be ask the ambassador to pop in and have a chat. Yes.
Interesting question, David. We have talked about the Palestinian situation here, and we try to understand the situation. But I think the one thing that I've not heard from you is an understanding of the Israeli situation. Now, why I ask that question is, Israel was actually born out of the ashes of the Second World War. Within weeks of the foundation of the State of Israel, it was attacked by 3 separate countries. And it has been attacked several times since. So what I see in the State of Israel is a country under siege. But that may not be something that we can understand in terms of what they're doing in the Gaza Strip, which I think is reprehensible by anyone's standard. But to understand what's going on, we also have to understand the Israeli siege mentality. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I'm sorry if that didn't come through. Look, there is absolutely no doubt that Israel sees itself as being besieged and being under attack, and therefore it needs to be strong. Obviously, that a lot of that stems from the Second World War and the Holocaust and the people who ended up settling there. I was just thinking about my neighbours. Both sets of neighbours who are on both sort of sides of me, if you like, and where I lived in Jerusalem, were either involved with the Holocaust, or their parents were. So that's in very much in their minds. It's very much at the forefront of their minds. It's true that on Syria, antagonistic, Lebanon and Hezbollah certainly antagonistic, Egypt in a sense is now they've had a peace agreement with Egypt. Jordan is much more settled, so it's not quite as complex as it was. I think the problem, in a sense, is now that I was just trying to explain it. I think for many Israelis, what they see this as a battle of survival, and I don't think there's a. So when you get rockets come in, it's feeding that sense of that we need to be able to survive, and therefore we need to be strong. The problem is that the longer you stay as an occupier, the more you become, in a sense, immune to the feelings of those people who are around you are occupying. So there's a sort of almost a contradiction there. On the one hand, they're victims, but then they're victimising other people. It's a bizarre thing. And I was reading a very interesting article the other day which was likening to the British that were in Ireland. That after a while, the British being in Ireland stopped seeing the Irish as Irish. I mean, they just sort of saw them as an impediment, people who were attacking them unfairly and all the rest of it. There was a new kind of rationale entered their minds because they were occupiers. And I think the same thing's happening for the Palestinians, like I was telling you about with these young kids. They don't see Israelis as being in any way legitimate or whatever. They just see them as being somebody that they need to kill and attack. And in the same way, the Israelis see them as being people who are going to kill and attack them. So they need to control them and contain them. But the two attitudes end up nowhere. I mean, there's no out to them. So it's just one force against another, and both sides don't see the pain of the other. It's way gone. I mean, it might have been 20 years ago they could actually understand it. Now it's way gone. I don't sense it's there anymore. Yeah. Kath. No.
Regarding that last comment, that Palestinians don't just want to kill Israeli.
No, I don't want to say all, because I mean, please don't put words in my mouth. I mean, there's lots of Palestinians who have worked in Israel and have gone backwards and forwards, and so it's just those kids that I was speaking about.
I just want to say something about the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. So it's initiated by 176 Palestinian civil society organisations. So that's unions, doctors, teachers, lawyers, women organisations, student organisations, civil society organisations, and it very much comes from Palestinian civil society. There are three demands of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And those are, number one, ending the occupation and colonisation of the 1967 occupied territories, so the West Bank and Gaza, and also East Jerusalem and Golan Heights. Ending the system of racial discrimination in Israel, which Palestinians living in Israel have 50 different discriminatory laws against them, so that's also very important. And thirdly, Palestinian refugees to be allowed to return to their homes. So those three demands of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement are very simple, and it doesn't get into taking any sort of political position on any sort of issues like one-state solution, two-state solution. It doesn't take any sort of political position at all on anything else. It's simply those three demands which come from the Palestinian civil society. So therefore, leaving these issues up to the United Nations or to governments to put these processes or to Israel to solve, so far hasn't resulted in an end to the occupation or the settlements or the war, even though...
Excuse me, is there a question here? Or
Yeah, I mean, maybe we just want to,
I thought we came to listen to you.
Okay.
I actually just wanted to say that if anyone is interested in getting involved in the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, because someone asked, this is an effective way forward. And we believe that the people of conscience throughout the world, that this is really the way forward. This is what helps bring down the apartheid system in South Africa, and this is what people of conscience in the world can do. So if anyone's interested in the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, more than welcome to come and see us, because we are starting to cooperate.
My name's John Wilson. I live locally here. I'm not politically aligned or part of any group whatsoever. I grew up in New Zealand, and for me, the Israelis were heroes. They were countries surrounded by enemies who wanted to drive them into the sea. They held the moral high ground. They had that wonderful radon on Tebby. But I've come 180 degrees in my course of my life. We just see so many children killed. Just gets to the point saying, what's going on here? And it's really just a comment, David, but isn't fundamentally the problem here one of injustice and massive breathtaking injustice. I mean, imagine if New Zealand in 1946, sitting here very happily, and then someone from outside said, well, we're going to carve out a decent-sized chunk of New Zealand. We're going to create the state of Israel. And the rest of you have to go into the other parts. Now, gradually, we all end up in Wairarapa and Wellington and maybe Southland, but the rest of the country declared a separate state. Think of the injustice of being pushed out of Europe. And they were pushed out. I lived in the Middle East for 13 years. I discovered that Arabs are people just like us. They're not terrorists, as Israel and America believe and would like us to believe. They're just people wanting to do the things that we